Welcome to The Deep Dive, the show where we cut through the noise, sift through the research, and hand you the crucial insights you need to be truly well-informed. Today we're diving into something that might just turn your understanding of stability completely on its head. Think about the systems that govern our lives. Governments, economies, even our own personal routines. We often assume that the ideal state for them is one of rigid control, perfect order, absolute predictability. But what if that very pursuit of stability is actually, well, laying the groundwork for greater fragility, for massive, unpredictable breakdowns?
It's a really profound challenge to our conventional wisdom, isn't it? We're kind of conditioned to see chaos as the enemy, order as the ultimate good. But our sources today suggest that this perspective might be getting the story exactly backwards. What if true resilience, true strength, comes not from suppressing variation and randomness, but from intelligently embracing it, managing it?
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is to unpack a truly fascinating stack of sources that challenge this deeply ingrained notion. We've brought together insights from really diverse fields: political philosophy, economics, biology, even ancient wisdom, and, believe it or not, metallurgy. And they all seem to converge on this powerful, counterintuitive truth about the role of randomness and the critical importance of scale. Get ready to rethink how things really work, because we're about to explore why bigger isn't always better, why the quest for perfect order can be, frankly, a dangerous illusion, and how sometimes a little bit of well-managed chaos is precisely what we need to thrive. Okay, so let's start by dissecting this concept of scale, because it's foundational to everything we'll discuss today. Our sources introduce us to this idea of bottom-up variations, or sometimes they just call it noise. This is essentially the political volatility, the everyday frictions, the minor upsets, the local squabbles that naturally take place within small, contained units, like a municipality or a small community. You see disagreements over local ordinances, minor budget disputes, maybe a street being repaved in a way someone dislikes. It's messy, yeah, often like, but here's the kicker, and this is crucial: it's not scalable.
Right, that not scalable part is where the true insight really lies, I think. What the sources emphasize is that increasing the size of a community, say, taking it down to 5,000 people and multiplying it by 1,000, doesn't just make it a gigantic municipality. There's a qualitative, a nonlinear difference at play. It's like saying a baby human doesn't resemble a small adult. They are fundamentally different in their dynamics, their properties, their very operating systems. If you multiply the number of people in a given entity by 10, you don't simply preserve its properties, you get these profound transformations. The system behaves in an entirely different way. This nonlinearity, it explains why solutions that work beautifully in a small village often fail spectacularly when you try to apply them to a large state or a global institution. It's just a fundamental misreading of how complexity scales.
That nonlinearity is truly fascinating. It means the behavior of a small group, or, the dynamics of local friction, they don't just extrapolate linearly to a large one. The sources use Switzerland as a prime example, right? You have all these variations, this noise at the local level. Think about the daily instability in a cab driver's income, or the minor shifts in local political alliances in a canton, the frequent local referenda. Yet the aggregate system, the ensemble of cantons, somehow manages to produce this incredibly stable, resilient state. How does that actually work?
Well, it works precisely because the way people handle local affairs is vastly different from how they handle large, abstract public expenditures. The mechanisms of accountability, the very human responses, they change dramatically with scale. In Switzerland, that bottom-up volatility is allowed to run its course at the local level, which prevents it from accumulating and then exploding at the federal level. It's a decentralized approach to managing risk, basically. It's like allowing small, frequent fires to prevent a single catastrophic blaze. #TAG, human behavior, and the abstract versus concrete divide.
Right. And this difference in handling affairs, this qualitative shift you mentioned, it ties directly into how human behavior changes as we move from the concrete to the abstract. Tell us more about that, because it's a really powerful insight.
Okay, so in smaller units, like a municipality, behavior is deeply, intrinsically influenced by direct, in-person contact with peers. Our actions are constantly being observed by those we know, by those we interact with regularly, and this triggers our basic biological reactions, like shame or empathy. For instance, a civil servant in a small community would genuinely feel uncomfortable for his mistake and more responsible for them if he saw the affected people at church, or at the grocery store, or in the local market.
Right.
His body and biological response would actually direct him to avoid causing harm, because the consequences are immediate and personal. There's a direct feedback loop there.
Right, because the impact of your decisions, good or bad, it's visible, it's tangible, it's personal. You see the faces, you hear the stories. You might even be directly affected yourself. But then, if you shift to large bureaucracies, the situation is profoundly different. Here, as the sources say, others are abstract items due to a fundamental lack of social contact.
Exactly. The individual civil servant's brain starts leading with numbers, spreadsheets, statistics. Decisions get made based on abstract theories, on models, on projected outcomes, rather than on the direct human consequences. The human element, the direct impact on individuals, it just gets lost in the data, in the sheer scale of the operation. And this leads to a fundamentally different outcome than individual localized behavior.
Mm-hmm.
It's why our sources even suggest a book like The Wisdom of Crowds as a kind of counterpoint, contrasting the conditions under which collective intelligence emerges versus when it gets distorted by this kind of abstraction.
So tell us a bit more about that wisdom of crowds idea then. How does that contrast fit in?
Well, The Wisdom of Crowds argues that under very specific conditions like diversity of opinion, independence, decentralization, and a good way to aggregate views, a large group can be incredibly smart, often smarter than any single expert.
Okay.
But the key is those conditions. What happens in large, centralized bureaucracies is often the exact opposite. Information gets filtered, people think alike or are pressured to, decisions aren't independent, and the feedback loops are broken.
So instead of wisdom,
You get this detached statistical reasoning that can be really flawed because it misses the ground truth, the concrete reality that you'd get in the smaller settings.
that makes perfect sense. And the sources then give this really powerful, almost chilling example of this behavioral shift. Like a president or prime minister might be personally nonviolent, maybe a kind, family-oriented individual in their private life. But when they are making decisions from the POV of representing millions of people, from that abstract vantage point of national security or economic policy, they might become violent, authorize actions that lead to widespread suffering or death.
Precisely. And this isn't necessarily about their inherent character changing. It's a qualitative shift in behavior, driven by the sheer abstraction of their role and the scale they're operating on. The administration as a whole becomes kind of shielded from having to feel the sting of shame. The consequences are so far removed, so diluted by layers of bureaucracy and statistical reporting, that the direct biological feedback loop of personal responsibility is just broken.
Wow.
The sources strikingly put it, Stalin could not have existed in a municipality. In a small town, his actions would have immediate, visible personal repercussions. That kind of extreme abstract violence would be incredibly difficult to sustain.
Yeah.
But once you abstract human lives into numbers, once you're making decisions for billions, the moral and emotional calculus shifts dramatically. Accountability becomes diluted, almost non-existent in that direct human sense. #C. Anti-fragility of small versus fragility of large.
That's a profound, almost disturbing thought. But it leads directly to this incredibly powerful idea that small is more anti-fragile than the large. This is a crucial concept we'll explore more, anti-fragility. But essentially, small entities have this inherent resilience, a built-in ability to not just withstand shocks, but actually benefit and grow stronger from them.
Right. And conversely, the large is doomed to breaking. This isn't just an observation or some philosophical musing. The sources actually call it a mathematical property that applies universally across different domains. You see it in the natural world, right? The limitations on the size of very large mammals, they're more susceptible to extinction events. You see it in the corporate world, where gigantic corporations often struggle to adapt and can collapse spectacularly. And crucially for our discussion today, you see it in large administrations and centralized states. Their sheer scale, their inherent complexity, it just breeds a fragility that ultimately leads to their collapse or some kind of dramatic restructuring. The more interconnected and centrally controlled a system becomes, the more vulnerable it is to a single point of failure or an unexpected shock.
And a clear symptom of this doom of the large, if you will, is the proliferation of lobbyists. The sources point out that the race of lobbyists cannot exist in a municipality or a small region. Why is that?
Well, because in a small, concrete system, influence is direct, relationships are personal, and accountability is immediate. If you want something done in a small town, you talk to the mayor, the council members, your neighbors, right? Their decisions directly affect their own lives and the lives of people they know. The whole idea of hiring some high-priced intermediary to whisper in ears just doesn't really make sense. But in large abstract systems, where decisions are far removed from direct consequences, where bureaucrats might be leading with spreadsheets rather than human faces, influence becomes concentrated away from that direct accountability.
Ah, okay.
It creates a vacuum that lobbyists and special interests are perfectly designed to fill. They basically exploit the very abstraction of the system to exert influence that would be impossible in a truly anti-fragile localized structure. Tag to D. The psychological toll of abstraction.
Beyond the systemic issues, there's also a significant psychological toll to this abstraction, isn't there? Our sources argue that we humans quite simply scorn what is not concrete. We are fundamentally wired to respond to the tangible, the immediate, the personal.
That's absolutely right. Our emotional and cognitive wiring is, well, it's ancient. It evolved in small tribes where immediate threats and personal interactions were paramount. This means we are more easily swayed by a crying baby than by 1,000 people dying elsewhere that do not make it to our living room through the TV set. The suffering of an individual, presented concretely, whether it's a child in distress or a close friend experiencing hardship, it activates our empathy, compels us to act.
Right.
But abstract numbers, no matter how large they are, often fail to trigger that same primal response. We can intellectually grasp the concept of thousands dying, but it rarely evokes the visceral, motivating emotion of seeing one person suffer.
And here's where the sources hit you with a truly profound line, one that should give us all pause. One case is a tragedy, other is a statistic. Our emotional energy is completely blind to probability. We're geared to respond to the immediate, tangible suffering of an individual, but we struggle profoundly to connect with the abstract horror of 1,000 deaths or the statistical likelihood of a future disaster.
And the media, unfortunately, often exacerbates this fundamental human limitation. They play on our infatuations with anecdotes and our thirst for sensational. This, while compelling and sometimes necessary for driving engagement, can cause a great deal of unfairness and distort our perception of risk and urgency.
Oh, so?
Well, think about it. At this very moment, globally, one person is dying of diabetes every 7 seconds. It's a quiet, relentless epidemic. But how much news coverage does that really get?
Not much compared to other things.
Exactly. Compared to the wall-to-wall coverage for a hurricane, where we see vivid images of houses flying, people rescued from floods, the dramatic, immediate, visible tragedy. Both are tragic, of course.
Yeah.
But our emotional and societal response is disproportionately focused on the vivid anecdote, the sensational event, precisely because it is concrete. We react to the image, not the far more significant but abstract statistic.
This vulnerability, then, this human tendency to prioritize the concrete over the abstract, gets dangerously exploited by bureaucracies, doesn't it? They position civil servants to make decisions on abstract and theoretical matters with the illusion that they will be making them in a rational and accountable way.
Exactly. But as we've discussed, rationality and accountability shift dramatically when the human element is abstracted away into numbers and spreadsheets. It's a systemic flaw that incentivizes a kind of detached, statistical approach to governance that often loses sight of individual human impact.
Yeah.
It's built into the structure of large systems.
Okay, this brings us to a really fundamental distinction that underpins much of our discussion today.
Uh,
Two entirely different types of randomness. Our sources introduce us to mediocristan and extremistan, emphasizing that this isn't just a quantitative difference, like a little bit more or less. This is a qualitatively distinct difference, a difference in kind, not just degree.
Indeed. Think of it this way. Mediocristan is the realm of the everyday, the predictable, where, yeah, there are plenty of variations, but they might be scarce individually, and they tend to cancel out in the aggregate over time.
Mhm.
No single variation is so extreme that it dominates the whole or disproportionately influences the average.
Okay, give us an example.
Your daily calorie intake is a perfect example. On any given day, you might eat a bit more or a bit less. But even over a whole year, no single day's intake will represent a significant percentage of your total calories. You simply cannot double your weight in a single day or even a month through calorie intake alone.
Right.
The exceptions, the rare events, they play an inconsequential role in the long-term average. Heights of people, exam scores, maybe the number of steps you take in a day, these typically fall into mediocristan. A single anomaly won't warp the entire distribution.
But then you have extremistan, and this is where things get really interesting and, frankly, a lot more dangerous.
Yeah, extremistan is characterized by mostly stability and occasionally large chaos. Here, errors have large consequences and variations come in lumps. A few variations occur, but those that have taken place are extreme.
Okay, examples of extremistan.
Your net worth is a classic one. You can double it or lose half of it in a single moment due to a market crash, a successful investment, or some unforeseen financial event. Or think about novel sales. An astonishing majority of sales tend to come from just a tiny fraction of books, maybe 0.1% of all titles. The exception, the one in a thousand event, the mega bestseller, is dominant. It dictates the whole picture.
Wow.
And this applies profoundly to history itself, which, contrary to some smooth linear progression idea, often moves by discontinuous jumps from one state to another. Think of revolutions, major technological breakthroughs, or sudden political collapses. These aren't incremental changes. They're sudden, massive shifts.
And these come from the tails of the distribution, right? That's the fat tails concept.
Exactly. The concept of fat tails is essentially a synonym for extremistan. It means that the remote events, those way out in what is called the tails of a probability distribution, play a disproportionately massive role. These are the rare, seemingly insignificant possibilities that actually carry a huge impact when they happen.
So it's the difference between expecting maybe a slightly heavier rain shower versus bracing for a once-in-a-century flood.
Precisely. Or the difference between a minor market correction and a global financial crisis.
Hmm.
One is manageable noise within the system. The other fundamentally changes the system.
What's fascinating here is the immediate impact this distinction has on predictability. In extremistan, predictability is very low, the sources say. Mistakes appear rare because the system looks stable most of the time.
But they are large, often devastating when they occur.
Yes. And this ties directly into what the sources call the myth of planning. If you're living in extremistan, and arguably many important aspects of our world are in extremistan, attempting to predict the future with precision is, well, it's kind of a fool's errand.
Because the sources argue forcefully that the world is too random and unpredictable to base policy on visibility of future. In extremistan, trying to create long-term, rigid plans based on projecting past trends is fundamentally flawed. Why? Because these significant events, the ones that truly shape outcomes, are precisely the ones you cannot predict from past data. They are the black swans, the tail events.
So what survives isn't necessarily the best planned thing.
Not according to this view. What truly survives and thrives comes not from rigid planning or foresight, but from the interplay of some fitness and environmental conditions. Meaning, a system's inherent ability to adapt, to absorb shocks, and to evolve in response to unforeseen events. It's anti-fragility. This qualitative distinction between mediocristan and extremistan is really foundational to understanding why certain systems are inherently fragile, and why our conventional approaches to stability often backfire so badly.
Okay, now let's move from these technical definitions to a really vivid and frankly disturbing concept that illustrates the perils of extremistan, the Great Turkey Problem. Our sources describe how in extremistan, one is prone to be fooled by the properties of the past and can get the story exactly backwards. It's about being lulled into a false sense of security.
It really is. It's the illusion of safety, often created by deliberately suppressing natural volatility.
Yeah.
Imagine a system that looks, pseudo-smooth, with very little visible volatility. It appears calm, stable, predictable.
Wonderful.
Right.
Seems ideal.
But then, seemingly out of nowhere, it experiences a massive devastating jump, a catastrophic breakdown. This is the danger when a system is switched from one that produces steady but maybe controllable volatility, a mediocristan-like system, to one that is apparently safe by artificial means. It looks like a drop in volatility, a triumph of control, but it's actually accumulating hidden risks silently beneath the surface. It's like sweeping dirt under the rug. It disappears from view, but the pile just grows bigger and bigger until eventually the rug rips.
And the turkey. The turkey perfectly illustrates this terrifying dynamic. Tell us the story.
Okay, so imagine a turkey is fed for 1,000 days by a butcher. Every single morning, the butcher arrives with food. And every day, this event confirms to the turkey's staff of analysts. Let's imagine them as these highly credentialed statisticians working for the turkey, that the butcher loves it, that its life is perfectly secure. The confidence in that belief is maximal and very quiet and soothingly predictable for the turkey. All its data points confirm this lovely linear progression of increasing well-being and safety.
Everything looks great.
Everything looks great, maximal confidence. But then a few days before Thanksgiving comes that one day when it is Really not a very good idea to be a turkey.
Yeah.
The turkey gets a brutal, shocking revision of belief right at the moment of its maximal confidence, its highest perceived security. It's a sudden, discontinuous jump from peaceful prosperity to, well, utter annihilation.
Oh.
It is. And this is a quintessential black swan event for the turkey. But, as the sources critically point out, it's a black swan event just for the turkey, not for the butcher. The butcher knew all along what was coming. The risk wasn't unknown to the system as a whole, just to the vulnerable entity within it.
Right.
And this analogy illuminates what the sources call the mother of all harmful mistakes, mistaking absence of evidence for evidence of absence. Just because something hasn't happened yet, or in your recorded data, doesn't mean it won't happen. Just because you haven't seen a massive financial collapse in 20 years doesn't mean the underlying risk isn't building silently.
That's a huge mistake.
It's huge, and the sources warn it's profoundly prevalent in intellectual circles, in social sciences, and especially in policymaking. It leads to disastrous miscalculations of risk. It's why models built purely on past data often fail spectacularly when the true extremistan event, the black swan, finally occurs. The model simply didn't account for what it had never seen.
So, if being a turkey is so dangerous, then our mission in life becomes simply how not to be a turkey or, if possible, how to be a turkey in reverse. What does that mean?
It means becoming anti-fragile, that concept we touched on earlier, where something not only withstands shocks, but actually benefits and grows stronger from them. And the first, most crucial step in that journey, according to these sources, is figuring out the difference between true and manufactured stability.
Okay, true versus manufactured.
True stability is dynamic. It allows for small fluctuations, small stresses that keep the system alert and adaptive. Manufactured stability is rigid. It suppresses those small fluctuations, looks calm on the surface, but simply defers larger, more catastrophic events. It creates the turkey situation.
And we have a chilling historical example of what happens when these constrained volatility choke systems explode, right? The sources point to Iraq.
Yes, the abrupt toppling of Saddam Hussein and his highly centralized top-down Ba'ath Party regime by the United States in 2003. For decades, Saddam's iron fist had suppressed essentially all internal dissent, all local volatility. There was an artificial, manufactured stability enforced brutally.
So it looks stable from the outside, maybe?
To some extent, yes, if by stable you mean rigidly controlled. But what was the outcome of removing that rigid, centralized control? The sources state over 100,000 people died in the aftermath, and 10 years later, the place was still a mess, plagued by sectarian violence and instability. The removal of that artificial lid didn't lead to immediate freedom and stability. It unleashed decades of long suppressed volatility with devastating prolonged consequences. Why? Because the system had been deprived of its natural smaller release valves for so long. It's the forest fire analogy played out on a devastating geopolitical scale.
So if manufactured stability is so dangerous, if suppressing natural volatility only leads to bigger, more catastrophic explosions, what's the alternative? Our sources dive into this incredible paradox of control, starting with James Clerk Maxwell's pioneering work back in the 19th century on steam engine governors. Now, these were mechanisms designed to stabilize the engine's speed, right? Compensate for abrupt variations. They aimed at smoothing things out, at creating perfect order.
Exactly. And they apparently did, but paradoxically, sometimes brought about capricious behavior and crashes.
How could trying to stabilize something actually make it more unstable? That seems backwards.
It does, but it's a profound insight that really transcends engineering. Maxwell mathematically demonstrated this principle. Light control works. Close control leads to overreactions, sometimes cause the machinery to break into parts. Think about it. If your control mechanism is too sensitive or too rigid, it overcorrects for every tiny fluctuation. These overreactions can amplify rather than dampen the natural oscillations in the system, pushing it further and further out of balance until, bang, it breaks down entirely.
Okay.
And this isn't just about steam engines. It's presented as a universal principle that can be generalized across domains, from mechanical systems to biological organisms to economies and to political structures. When you try to overly control a system, when you aim for perfect stillness, you can actually make it less stable in the long run.
And we can see this very clearly in markets, can't we? The sources argue that things like fixing prices or trying to eliminate speculators, those so-called noise traders who bring that moderate, unpredictable volatility to the market,
Right, those actions provide an illusion of stability. You get these long, calm periods that feel safe, that feel good, but then they're punctuated by sudden large jumps
Hmm.
because the players in the system, the investors, the traders, they're unused to volatility. They haven't had the experience of adapting to constant smaller fluctuations.
So they panic more easily.
Precisely. If the market is artificially calm for too long, any slight variation in price then gets attributed to some big, scary cause, insider information, or some catastrophic unseen force rather than just normal market dynamics. This lack of exposure to natural noise makes participants overly sensitive, kind of jumpy,
Hmm.
and it causes widespread panic when even minor fluctuations occur. The sources argue, totally counterintuitively, that injecting some confusion, some moderate random volatility, actually stabilizes the system.
Hmm.
It's like the extremely punctual person who causes intense anxiety in his family if he's just a few minutes late, versus someone with a slightly more volatile schedule who causes no alarm at all. The system that experiences regular small shocks is just much better prepared for bigger ones. It builds resilience. Hashtag tag 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 BB. The purifying power of noise.
Okay, this idea of injecting noise or embracing small fluctuations leads to what the sources call the purifying power of noise. Tell us about the forest fire analogy because it's brilliant.
It's a perfect illustration, yeah. Small forest fires, the naturally occurring ones, they periodically cleanse the system of the most inflammable material.
Mm.
Dead wood, underbrush, accumulated debris. They prevent it from building up systematically over large areas.
Right, like housekeeping for the forest.
Exactly. The problem arises when, in the name of safety, we try to prevent all forest fires. We might succeed for a while, maybe even decades. But what happens is that all that inflammable material just continues to accumulate year after year. So while preventing forest fires from taking place appears to be safe in the short term, it actually makes the one more big one much worse when it finally happens. We essentially trade frequent, manageable cleanups for a single, devastating megafire that can destroy everything.
It's so counterintuitive, but it makes so much sense when you put it like that. And the same logic applies directly to the economy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Our sources argue that stability is not good for economy.
Right. Firms can become very weak in the long periods of steady prosperity, devoid of setbacks, because hidden vulnerabilities accumulate silently under the surface. Things look great, profits are steady, everyone feels secure. But the underlying structure might be getting brittle.
So trying to prevent recessions entirely might be bad.
According to this view, yes. Delaying a crisis, pushing it down the road with interventions, is not a very good idea. It's the equivalent of letting the forest grow thicker and thicker with deadwood, all the while thinking you're making it safer.
So what happens in markets then?
Well, the sources explain that an absence of fluctuations in this market causes hidden risks to accumulate with impunity. The longer a system goes without experiencing some kind of trauma or cleanup, the more fragile it becomes. The longer one goes without a market trauma, the worse will be the damage when commotion occurs. Veteran traders apparently understand this. They see a market hitting a new low, not just as a disaster, but often as a necessary cleanup, getting the weak hands out of the way.
Weak hands.
Yeah, these are people or institutions who are inherently fragile financially, but they don't know it, precisely because they've been lulled by a false sense of security during a long period of calm. When a real shock hits, many of them rush for the door simultaneously, and their collective panicked actions actually cause or significantly worsen the crash. They become the source of the instability they feared.
Okay, this concept of randomness being beneficial, it extends beyond just preventing catastrophe. It can actually unlock seemingly impossible impasses. The sources bring up the classic thought experiment of Buridan's donkey. What's that about?
Right, Buridan's donkey. It's a philosophical puzzle.
Mhm.
Imagine a donkey, equally famished and thirsty. It's placed at an exact equal distance between a bale of hay and a bucket of water. In pure, cold rationality, it has no logical reason to choose one over the other. They are perfectly equivalent.
So it's stuck.
Exactly.
Yeah.
According to the strictest logic, it should unavoidably die of both hunger and thirst, completely paralyzed by indecision. The perfect symmetry prevents action. So what's the solution?
What is the solution?
It's elegantly simple. A random nudge one way or the other can unlock it. A slight, unpredictable push towards either the hay or the water breaks the deadlock, breaks the symmetry, and allows the donkey to survive. In some dangerous impasses, the sources argue, the absence of randomness equals guaranteed death. This parable highlights how a touch of unpredictability, even seemingly irrational noise, can be absolutely vital for moving forward when pure logic offers no path.
And this isn't just philosophy, it has incredibly compelling scientific parallels, most notably in a mechanism called stochastic resonance. That sounds complicated.
It sounds complicated, but the idea is fascinating. Stochastic resonance is a phenomenon where adding random noise to the background makes you hear the sounds with much more accuracy.
Adding noise makes things clearer. How?
Yeah, it's weird, right? Imagine you have a very weak signal, maybe a faint whisper, that's just below the threshold of what your ears or maybe a detector can pick up on its own. If you add a carefully calibrated amount of random background noise, not too much, not too little, that weak signal can actually become audible. The noise effectively helps to occasionally push the weak signal plus noise combination across the detection threshold just enough so that it stands out, making it detectable. It's
Wow.
totally counterintuitive because we usually think of noise as obscuring signals, right?
Mhm.
But here, it clarifies them. The sources state quite powerfully, nothing in that situation does better than randomness, which comes for free. It's a natural, cost-effective way to enhance sensitivity and make weak but potentially important information discernible. ###D. The transformative power of annealing, political and beyond.
This idea of randomness as a tool for transformation, even for optimization, leads us to another brilliant analogy from the sources, annealing. Now, in metallurgy, annealing is a technique used to strengthen metals, right? By heating them up and cooling them slowly.
Exactly. You heat them to a high temperature and then cool them slowly in a controlled way. And what's happening on a microscopic level during this process is key. During the heating phase, the atoms in the metal basically get unstuck. They gain enough energy to wander around randomly, breaking free from their existing, often imperfect or stressed, crystalline structures.
So they're just bouncing around?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
Then during the controlled cooling phase, as they lose energy, they are encouraged to settle into new, better configurations, forming a more ordered, less stressed, and ultimately stronger material. It's a kind of local brand of anti-fragility, if you will.
Like the source mentions the anecdote about the father tapping the wooden barometer.
Exactly. That gentle random tap helps the mechanism overcome any internal stickiness or friction and settle into its correct, true reading. It unsticks the system locally.
And mathematicians have taken this principle and applied it computationally in something called simulated annealing to solve incredibly complex problems. How does that work?
Well, simulated annealing in computers is basically an algorithm that mimics the physical annealing process. It's used to find more general, optimal solutions to problems and situations, specifically solutions that only randomness can deliver. It allows the algorithm to explore a vast solution space and, crucially, to sometimes accept worse solutions temporarily, like the heating phase, to avoid getting stuck in suboptimal local solutions and potentially find the much better global optimum later during the cooling phase.
Interesting.
The sources even cite a controversial 1975 paper that apparently showed random drilling was superior to whatever search method has been employed at that time for finding natural resources, implying that sometimes a completely unpredictable random exploration can be more effective than rigid, logical, but ultimately limited systematic searches.
And perhaps most counterintuitively, the sources claim that even chaotic systems, systems that are inherently unstable and unpredictable, can be stabilized by adding randomness to them.
Yeah, that one's mind-bending. The example given is of balls jumping chaotically on a table until completely random but low-intensity shocks were introduced, which paradoxically made them settle into an orderly, predictable pattern. Adding noise reduced the chaos.
So if randomness can stabilize chaos in physics and optimize solutions in computation, what about politics? This seems like a leap.
Well, the sources make that leap quite provocatively. They argue that a certain dose of randomness is needed the most in politics. They present this incredible parable of a city where rulers randomly assign jobs, which leads to rebellion, but then they flip it. Maybe we should have citizens randomize the job of rulers, naming them by raffles and removing them at random.
Wow! Like a lottery for politicians.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
They say this is similar to simulated annealing and appears no less effective in achieving optimal governance. Now, that's obviously a radical thought.
It is radical, but you mentioned ancient wisdom earlier. Did they do anything like this?
Apparently so. The sources say the ancients were acutely aware of this need for random turnover. Members of the Athenian assemblies, for instance, were chosen by a lot method meant to protect the system from degeneracy. They understood that concentrating power, even well-intentioned power, in the same hands for too long could lead to stagnation, corruption, and fragility. Random selection injected a refreshing dose of anti-fragility.
And modern simulations back this up.
Some do, yeah. The sources mention computer simulations showing how adding a certain amount of randomly selected politician to the process can improve the functioning of the parliamentary system. It shakes things up, prevents entrenchment. And then there's Voltaire, who super provocatively suggested the best government was one tampered with political assassinations, calling regicide a sort of equivalent of tapping on the barometer.
Okay, wait, assassination, that's extreme.
Extremely provocative, yes. Obviously, the sources aren't advocating violence. Voltaire was likely using hyperbole to articulate a stark observation. Historically, such events, however brutal, created needed reshuffling that wouldn't happen voluntarily. They prevented entrenched power from becoming completely stagnant or oppressive. It was a crude historical form of forced annealing, if you like.
And this idea of forced turnover, or rather the need for it, is particularly relevant today, the sources argue, because of the secular drop in premature deaths. How does that connect?
Well, modern society, with its advances in medicine and general stability, has inadvertently deprived us of what the sources call naturalistic managerial turnover. People live longer, careers are longer, CEOs, tenured academics, politicians, senior journalists, they all tend to stay in their positions for much longer than historical norms. There's less natural churn.
So things get stuck.
Things can get stuck, yeah?
Yeah.
The sources suggest we might need to offset this condition with some form of random lotteries for positions of power, acknowledging the inherent challenge with political parties that don't have organic built-in expiration date. The absence of natural turnover means the system, instead of periodically shedding its weaker parts or refreshing its leadership, just accumulates inertia, vested interests, and vulnerability. It loses that annealing quality. #####E ancient wisdom and randomness.
It's fascinating how much of this seems to echo ancient practices. You mentioned divination before.
Yes, it's worth noting how the ancients seem to intuitively grasp the power of random draws. They perfected the method of random draw in more or less difficult situations and integrated it into divinations. These draws, whether by casting lots, reading entrails, or interpreting random signs, weren't necessarily about predicting the future accurately. Often they were really meant to be pick a random exit without having to make a decision so one would not have to live with the burden of consequences.
So it was a way to break a deadlock, like Buridan's donkey, but for humans.
Exactly. It was a profound way to diffuse the immense psychological weight of difficult choices, to externalize the decision and accept the outcome without the endless internal struggle or regret. It introduced randomness to overcome paralysis.
Like the ancient method mentioned from Virgil's Aeneid, where you'd open the epic poem at random and interpret the first line you see as direction for your current dilemma.
Yeah, exactly that kind of thing.
Yeah.
The sources even provocatively suggest using such a method for very sticky business decisions, a kind of intellectual random walk to break mental impasses when logic fails.
Huh. I'm not sure my boss would go for that.
Probably not. But on a more relatable, personal level, they offer a charming anecdote. The author sometimes randomly picks restaurant menu items just to avoid the tyranny of choice and find peace of mind.
Okay, I could see doing that.
It's a small but potent example, right? Embracing a little randomness for personal anti-fragility and well-being in daily life. Letting go of the need for perfect, rational control to find a potentially better or at least less stressful outcome. #BV. Historical proof points and nuances.
Okay, let's try and bring all this home now with some compelling historical proof points, starting with Switzerland, which our sources present as a prime example of the natural anti-fragility of political systems. Its remarkable, long-standing stability, they argue, is achieved not by minimizing noise, but by managing noise, having a mechanism for letting it run its natural course. It's like a decentralized laboratory of small fluctuations.
Exactly right. Switzerland's federalist structure allows for significant autonomy at the canton and municipal levels. This means that local disagreements, political shifts, even economic fluctuations tend to be contained and absorbed at a smaller scale, preventing them from escalating into national crises. And there's an interesting detail about Switzerland mentioned which might contribute to this anti-fragility. Its historically lower level of university education compared to other rich nations.
Lower university education helps.
Well, the argument is that its success, even in complex areas like banking and precision manufacturing, wasn't primarily built on abstract academic knowledge, what the source calls episteme or knowledge of know-what. Instead, it was built on an apprenticeship model focused on technique, crafts, and know-how. Practical, hands-on competence learned through doing rather than purely theoretical knowledge. This hands-on practical approach fosters a robust, ground-up competence that might be more resistant to the fragility often associated with abstract theoretical governance or top-down planning.
Interesting. Less abstraction, more concrete know-how. Now let's contrast that Swiss example with a chilling counterexample. The northern Levant, roughly today's northern part of Syria and Lebanon. Our sources describe it as perhaps the most prosperous province in the history of mankind over an astonishing 12,000 years.
Yeah, 12 millennia. This wasn't just some transient boom. It was sustained multi-millennial prosperity. And the secret to its success.
What was it?
It was deeply rooted in being dominated by traders and agriculture, and crucially, its immense local autonomy. Historically, empires like the Roman and Ottoman, before the 20th century, largely allowed local elites to run the province pretty much as they saw fit. Their focus was primarily on collecting tax and raising armies for war. This actually led to periods like the Pax Automa and Pax Romana that were incredibly good for commerce because the imperial power provided broad security but didn't meddle too much locally.
So, cities operated like mini-states.
Effectively, yes. Cities like Aleppo and Emsa operated effectively as city-states separated from the hinterland, fostering a vibrant, decentralized prosperity that allowed diverse cultural and economic hubs to flourish independently. This inherent decentralization acted as a form of anti-fragility, allowing the region to absorb external shocks and internal disagreements without collapsing entirely for centuries.
But then, after World War I, things dramatically changed. Part of the Levant was integrated into the newly created centralized nation of Syria. And here's where the problem started, according to the sources.
Right. The modernist Ba'ath Party eventually came to power. They saw the traditional decentralized system, with all its local variations and complexities, as an archaic mess. They wanted clean lines, order, control, so they centralized the place, enforcing state law with an iron fist, imposing a uniform, top-down structure. The effect, our sources tell us quite starkly, was instant decline for once vibrant cities like Aleppo and Emsa.
Why the instant decline?
Their modernization program removed what they considered the archaic mess of local structures, traditions, and autonomy, and replaced them with the crisp modernism of centralized office buildings, state planning, and rigid control. And what happened? The trading families, the very engine of the region's prosperity for millennia, immediately fled, taking their knowledge, their networks, and their capital with them. The lifeblood drained out.
And there's that chilling quote.
Yes. The chilling quote from an Aleppo merchant who fled the Ba'ath regime truly captures the essence of this destructive centralization.
We people of Aleppo prefer war to prison. He wasn't necessarily talking about literal jail, though that was certainly a risk too. He meant the loss of political and economic freedoms, the stifling of local initiative, the destruction of their way of life due to the centralized, abstract control imposed from Damascus. It was a prison of conformity and lost autonomy.
Wow.
This perfectly illustrates how the modern obsession with order and centralization, often implemented under the guise of progress or modernization, creates the illusion of strength while actually breeding profound weakness and fragility. Wars and empires, ironically, often destroy rich, multiple cultural hubs by imposing a singular, fragile order onto inherently diverse and anti-fragile systems.
Lebanon, too, offers a nuanced perspective on this. Initially, it seemed to have all the right qualities for prosperity, maybe a bit like Switzerland in some ways. Yeah, initially it looked promising according to this framework. It was small enough to be a municipality on its own. It had a commercially friendly atmosphere and a benign, smaller, disorganized state without any real central government. It seemed like the perfect embodiment of small is beautiful, decentralized, and entrepreneurial.
But it didn't end well, did it?
No. And Lebanon presents a critical caveat here.
Yeah.
It was maybe one step of disorganized. It became too loose. While a certain amount of decentralization and slight chaos can be productive, there's clearly a point where a system crosses the threshold and becomes truly chaotic, losing all coherence and self-regulating mechanisms.
What happened specifically?
By allowing various Palestinian factions and later Christian militias to openly own heavy weapons and operate largely outside any effective central authority, it inadvertently caused an arm race and eventually spiraled into a devastating civil war starting in 1975. This is a really important distinction. Anti-fragility isn't about complete anarchy or total lack of structure. It's about intelligently managing noise, allowing for small, frequent fluctuations within a broadly stable framework to prevent large, catastrophic ones. But when there are no underlying rules, no shared understanding of boundaries, no mechanism to contain conflict, then too loose becomes just a recipe for self-destruction.
So the core lesson here is incredibly powerful and nuanced. It's not just decentralize everything.
No, not at all. It's more like longevity and resilience seem to require decentralization, a degree of freedom, and the acceptance of slight chaos, because these are fundamentally more productive than rigid order in the
Yeah.
long run. State centralization is fragile, local economy is anti-fragile, but there's a balance. It's not a call for total disorder, but for an intelligent embracing of dynamism over static control, finding that sweet spot between rigid fragility and destructive chaos. Hashtag day India's cultural robustness.
Well, one last example. India's remarkable cultural robustness. How does that fit this model?
Well, our sources highlight India's cultural advantage as stemming precisely from its incredible internal diversity. Its many languages and different cultures, which inherently creates so much rift, so much internal friction or noise. Paradoxically, this very multiplicity is presented as a profound strength.
How does that make it strong? Seems like it would cause problems.
It does cause problems, of course, but the argument is about resilience. It means that, for instance, a single sentiment towards God will not infuriate the entire country. Unlike perhaps more centralized religions or cultures, where an affront to a single prophet, a single sacred text, or a single central figure can potentially infuriate an entire global following.
Right.
India's inherent diversity means you cannot attack Hinduism as such because Hinduism is very vast. There isn't one single point of failure, one single doctrine or figure that represents the whole. It's this massive, complex collection of diverse traditions, beliefs, and practices.
So it's robust because it's not monolithic.
Exactly. This isolated individual nature of belief, this inherent multiplicity and internal noise, means that a single shock, a single controversy, a single attack cannot bring the entire system down. It contributes to its profound, millennia-spanning robustness, making it incredibly resilient to attempts at centralized cultural or religious control from within or without. It's anti-fragile through its diversity. Hashtag outro.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the core counterintuitive insight seems really clear. True stability and anti-fragility don't come from suppressing variation and randomness, from striving for that perfectly smooth, predictable world.
Right. Instead, they seem to come from intelligently embracing and managing that randomness, from understanding its purifying power, even its creative potential.
We've explored how small-scale volatility can protect us from large-scale catastrophes, how human behavior changes so drastically with scale and abstraction, and how that seductive illusion of safety, the turkey problem, can set us up for devastating, unpredictable breakdowns.
And understanding that crucial distinction between mediocristan and extremistan, recognizing the potential benefits of noise and fat tails, and even pondering the surprising wisdom of Buridan's donkey, or the transformative power of annealing. It can profoundly change how you view current events, maybe your own decisions, and the complex systems you interact with every day. It challenges us to look beyond the surface calm and try to identify where those hidden risks might be accumulating unseen.
Indeed. It forces us to ask ourselves, doesn't it? Given that preventing small fluctuations often makes larger catastrophes more likely, what stabilizing actions are we taking in our societies, our economies, maybe even our personal lives that might actually be setting us up for a much bigger fall down the road?
Are we unconsciously becoming turkeys in our own lives, blind to the true nature of risk because we've engineered away all the visible volatility, all the little warning signs?
It's a great question. How can we apply this wisdom of accepting randomness, of allowing for intelligent disorder, and fostering true bottom-up anti-fragility in our own spheres to become genuinely more resilient?
It's definitely something to ponder deeply as you navigate the wonderfully unpredictable and perhaps necessarily messy world around us.